The fork clattered against the ceramic plate, a sharp, unwelcome sound cutting through the forced cheer of our Thanksgiving dinner. It was my mother's hand, trembling slightly as she gestured, that dropped it. Her eyes, usually a watery blue, were narrowed, fixed on me with an intensity that made the turkey suddenly taste like ash in my mouth. "Honestly," she'd said, her voice a low, cutting whisper that somehow carried across the entire table, "some people are just burdens. Unemployed, no prospects. Honestly, dear, what's your contribution to this family?" My father, across the table, had merely nodded, a subtle, almost imperceptible tilt of his head that was more damning than any spoken word. The air thickened, heavy with unspoken accusations and a judgment I'd felt simmering for years, but never so explicitly articulated. My normal had always been a delicate balancing act. I was the responsible one, the one who quietly absorbed the emotional fallout, the one who managed expectations and smoothed over their rough edges. While my siblings chased fleeting successes and dramatic failures, I'd built a quiet, steady life. I'd invested wisely, saved diligently, and cultivated a career that, while not flashy, provided a secure foundation. They called it playing it safe. I called it having a plan. The truth was, their pronouncements of my lack of ambition were a projection of their own insecurities, a way to feel superior by diminishing my carefully constructed stability. They thrived on drama, on the spectacle of lavish gifts and grand pronouncements. My quiet competence was an affront to their narrative of struggle and triumph. There was the time, a few years back, when my father had borrowed a significant sum from my savings account. He'd promised to pay it back with his next big investment, a sure thing, he'd said, with a wink and a clap on my shoulder. The investment, predictably, evaporated. He never mentioned the loan again, and I never asked. The sheer audacity of it, the casual assumption that my resources were an extension of his own, still made my stomach clench. Then there was my mother, meticulously going through my grandmother's jewelry box after the funeral, separating pieces into piles, a ledger open on her lap. She'd looked up, met my gaze, and with a saccharine smile, said, "Oh, darling, don't you worry. We'll make sure everything is distributed." The implied critique of my own modest inheritance was palpable, a subtle dig at my lack of need compared to my siblings who always seemed to be in financial straits. These were not isolated incidents, they were brushstrokes on a larger canvas of entitlement and a subtle, persistent chipping away at my sense of autonomy. I'd learned to bite my tongue, to let the words slide past, to absorb their passive-aggressive barbs like a sponge. But the sponge was getting heavy. The accusation hung in the air, a toxic fog. Unemployed. The word felt like a brand, slapped onto my forehead for all to see, for all to agree with. My father, his gaze now directly on me, chimed in, his voice resonating with an authority he seemed to believe was his by divine right. "We've been discussing this, you know. Your future. It's not looking good. We've done all we can for you, frankly. It's time you pulled your weight." My siblings, ever the audience, nodded in agreement, their faces a mixture of pity and smug satisfaction. The table, set with the finest china and overflowing with the bounty of the harvest, felt like a stage for a performance I hadn't auditioned for. I looked at my mother, her lips pursed, her eyes glinting with a triumphant satisfaction. Then I looked at my father, his expression one of stern, parental duty, a man who believed he was acting in my best interest, even as he delivered a blow that felt like a betrayal. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a hammer blow against the fragile edifice of our family facade. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, a premonition of something significant shifting. I took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing myself to remain outwardly calm, to not give them the satisfaction of seeing my distress. Later that evening, after the obligatory pleasantries and the dessert I couldn't stomach, I excused myself. I went to my childhood bedroom, a room preserved in a state of nostalgic amber, and sat on the edge of the bed. The veneer of pleasant family gathering had cracked, revealing the rot beneath. Their words, so casually delivered, had struck a nerve, not out of hurt, but out of a cold, dawning clarity. They saw me as a dependent, a perpetual child who needed their guidance, their permission, their financial oversight. They had underestimated me, not just in my career, but in my capacity to protect myself. The entitled pronouncements, the subtle financial manipulations, the casual disregard for my autonomy, it had all culminated in his Thanksgiving pronouncement, this public declaration of my perceived inadequacy. It was the moment I stopped enduring and started planning. I retrieved a worn leather-bound ledger from my closet, the same one my mother had used after Grandma's funeral. It contained meticulously recorded details of loans, investments, and agreements made over the years, not just with my parents, but with other family members. Hidden within its pages were the terms of a substantial loan I had provided my parents for their latest sure-thing investment, a business venture that, naturally, had also failed. The loan agreement, signed by both of them, stipulated a clear repayment schedule, with specific penalties for default. It also included a clause that, in the event of non-payment, allowed for the seizure of assets equal to the outstanding debt. I had drafted it myself, with the help of a very discreet lawyer, years ago, anticipating a scenario just like this. They had seen it as a formality, a piece of paper. I had seen it as my safety net. The following morning, the house was still quiet, the remnants of Thanksgiving scattered around. My parents were enjoying their coffee, no doubt strategizing their next move in the ongoing narrative of my perceived failings. I walked into the living room, not with anger, but with a calm, almost unnerving serenity. I held a manila envelope, stark white against my dark clothing. My father looked up, a question in his eyes. "What's that?" he asked, his tone still laced with that patronizing authority. I placed the envelope on the coffee table between them. "It's a statement," I said, my voice level and devoid of emotion. My mother reached for it, her fingers brushing against the crisp paper. She opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. Her brow furrowed, then her eyes widened, flicking from the document to my face, then back again. My father leaned over, snatching the envelope from her. He read, his face a mask of disbelief. The lines around his mouth deepened, his jaw tightening. The smugness that had been so prevalent the night before was replaced by a dawning horror. The silence in the room was no longer the tense quiet of unspoken judgment, but the stunned, frozen silence of realization. He looked at me, truly looked at me, for the first time in years, not as his dependent child, but as someone who had just irrevocably altered his reality. What is this?" he stammered, his voice a harsh rasp. I met his gaze, a flicker of something cold and final in my own. "It's the enforcement of the loan agreement," I stated, the words precise and deliberate. "You defaulted. This is the consequence." The color drained from their faces, replaced by a ghastly pallor. The entitlement that had fueled their pronouncements the night before dissolved, leaving behind only shock and a dawning fear. The aftermath was swift and, for them, devastating. The text started almost immediately. My mother, a flurry of panicked messages, accusing me of being cruel, heartless, ungrateful. My siblings, naturally, took their sides, bombarded with carefully curated tales of my supposed betrayal. Flyers were sent out, subtly hinting at my financial irresponsibility, attempting to garner sympathy and paint me as the villain. But the narrative had shifted. The quiet execution had rendered their accusations impotent. They had banked on my emotional reaction, my willingness to be shamed. They hadn't factored in my meticulous planning, my quiet resilience. The banks, presented with the legally binding documents and the irrefutable evidence of default, acted efficiently. The jointly owned family vacation home, their primary asset, was frozen, then eventually liquidated to cover the debt. The luxurious car my father so adored was repossessed. The substantial investment accounts they thought were untouchable, the ones I'd indirectly helped fund with my own loan, were emptied. Their frantic attempts to leverage other family members for bailouts were met with polite refusals, or worse, a chilling silence as those who knew them well recognized the inevitable. They had gambled their financial future on their own perceived superiority and lost, spectacularly. Their social standing, built on a foundation of ostentatious displays and borrowed influence, crumbled as their financial reality became undeniable. They were no longer the pillars of the community, they were cautionary tales. I received no further calls, no more texts. The silence that descended was not one of resentment or regret on my part, but a profound, almost serene quiet. I had simply enforced a contract. I had extracted what was owed. The satisfaction wasn't in their ruin, but in the restoration of balance, in the cold, hard fact that their entitlement had finally met its match. It was a quiet justice, delivered not with thunderous pronouncements, but with the rustle of paper and the chilling finality of consequence.